King Charles III is officially ascending to the British throne to be the new monarch. And for the first time in history, we're able to watch the ceremony at home from start to finish.
The quiet inside Windsor Castle on that rain-heavy afternoon held a tension far heavier than any palace decree delivered in living memory. Standing together away from the flashing lights and public spectacles, Prince William and Duchess Sophie faced the recording lens with an expression that instantly signaled a profound turning point for the British monarchy. They were not there to celebrate an anniversary or announce a routine royal itinerary. Instead, they were preparing to confirm what the royal household had desperately concealed behind closed doors for many agonizing months. King Charles III had suffered severe, unrelenting complications during his ongoing medical treatments and had privately accepted the heartbreaking reality that he could no longer shoulder the full, exhausting burden of daily sovereign duties. This monumental disclosure was not an abdication, as formal abdication means completely giving up the throne and surrendering the royal crown to the next in line. Charles was to remain the reigning monarch, retaining his constitutional authority, but the relentless, punishing public rhythm that had defined the opening chapter of his reign had officially come to an end. William's voice tightened perceptibly as he began to read the prepared statement, pausing deliberately before speaking his father's name. That brief, heavy silence spoke volumes, exposing the raw emotion and deep anxiety that his carefully controlled tone struggled to conceal from the watching world. The prince explained that persistent physical complications had made a full return to his former workload utterly impossible, forcing the king to officially transfer the vast majority of his daily responsibilities to senior members of the royal family. Beside him, Duchess Sophie tightened her grip on the edge of the table, her presence offering a steady anchor while she recalled the private frustration and bitter anger behind that agonizing decision. She recounted how Charles had repeatedly prepared for public engagements, dressing in full regalia with immense determination, only to discover at the very last moment that his fading physical strength could no longer support his iron willpower. For the sovereign, appearances were never merely check marks on a calendar. They were the visible proof that the institution remained stable, enduring, and deeply connected to the people. Service was a solemn promise he had made to the nation upon ascending the throne, and the inability to keep that promise tore at his sense of duty. William then revealed a darker, more complex layer of the unfolding crisis. He confirmed that his father had actually reached this life-altering conclusion months prior, during a private moment of realization that caught even his closest advisors off guard. For months, the royal household had systematically presented each sudden cancellation as a temporary setback, buying precious time while quietly constructing an entirely new working framework behind the scenes. William firmly insisted that medical professionals had not forced Charles into this corner, nor had advisors maneuvered him out of power. The choice belonged entirely to the monarch himself, a poignant realization that made the confession infinitely more painful for everyone involved. Sophie watched closely as William lifted a folded, handwritten message bearing the king's distinct private seal. A private seal is a deeply personal mark utilized to protect confidential correspondence, and its presence guaranteed that every single word had originated directly from Charles's own hand. The prince disclosed the primary intent of the letter, but abruptly refused to read the final, deeply personal paragraph out loud. His throat constricted, and he placed the confidential note beside an untouched glass of water, remaining seated without moving when the recording officially ended. Sophie stayed right beside him in total silence, a powerful visual cue that immediately left a lingering question hanging over the ancient halls of Windsor. Why had Charles chosen her instead of Camilla or a senior palace official to stand by his side? The answer was rooted within the tight-knit private circle that had fiercely protected the king while his physical vitality quietly ebbed away. To the general public, William was the undeniable heir, and Sophie was merely one of the monarchy's most dependable, hard-working figures. For Charles, however, they had evolved into something immeasurably more personal. William was the son expected to inherit his immense burden, while Sophie had become the trusted confidant chosen to witness his absolute weakest hours. Their joint appearance was meticulously orchestrated, The final outcome of months spent shielding a man who harbored a profound fear that admitting his physical limitations would be misinterpreted by a cynical public as abandoning the sacred crown. Throughout his entire adult life, William had prepared for the monumental day he would inherit the throne, but nothing in his rigorous preparation could have ever trained him to watch his own father steadily weaken behind closed doors. Every single decline in the king's physical strength pushed the prince closer to responsibilities he never wanted to claim through suffering and sorrow. As the heir, his primary duty was to protect the king as a loving son. Yet as the future monarch, he was also forced to demand brutal honesty before escalating uncertainty completely shattered public confidence in the entire institution. Sophie carried a uniquely heavy burden of her own through these difficult months. Years of quiet, uncomplaining service had transformed her into an indispensable bridge between frightened palace aides and confused royal relatives who struggled to comprehend the king's rapidly changing condition. She had tirelessly helped preserve a reassuring public schedule, allowing reduced engagements to appear as minor, temporary adjustments even when she harbored a terrifying suspicion that the sovereign might never be strong enough to resume his former workload. That compassionate choice successfully protected the monarch from premature public pressure, but it also left the trusted confidant burdened with a profound sense of private guilt. Silence had successfully bought valuable time for the palace, but it had simultaneously made the ultimate truth infinitely more dangerous when it finally broke. The breaking point had not arrived through a sudden media leak or a political scandal, but on a grim, rain-heavy morning at Windsor Castle 3 months before a single word reached the public. Charles had insisted on personally reviewing the vital government papers placed inside his traditional red box, stubbornly determined to prove to himself that illness had not impaired his sharp constitutional judgment. Halfway through the very first page, however, his fingers began to tremble violently. He read the exact same sentence 3 times in a row, utterly unable to process its meaning, before lowering his heavy gold-nibbed pen and quietly confessing to Sophie that he could no longer feel where his public duty ended and sheer exhaustion began. Heavy rain lashed against the tall windows of the private study as Sophie watched the king stare blankly at the unfinished page before him. The red box contained official government documents sent securely to the reigning sovereign daily, allowing the monarch to stay fully informed and complete essential constitutional duties, even when public appearances vanish from the calendar. Those duties are vital because they directly connect the crown to the legislative work of the government. Charles had drastically reduced his public outings, but keeping up with his private paperwork allowed the palace communications team to describe him as actively engaged. Nobody ever mentioned how painfully long every single task took, or how deeply every stroke of the pen drained the king's remaining reserves of energy. Desperate to push through, Charles tried reading the briefing a second time, but the printed words blurred together into an incomprehensible haze. In a moment of sudden confusion, the king looked up and asked why the exact same briefing papers had been sent to him twice. Sophie immediately knew they had not. She closed the heavy oak door, gently slid the remaining papers out of his immediate reach, and listened as the king ordered her to summon William to the room without alerting the wider household staff. The trusted confidant obeyed instantly, but the raw fear etched across her face told the prince that this emergency meeting was unlike any that had come before it. William arrived in the private quarters to find the uncapped pen resting awkwardly across an unsigned government page. His father desperately insisted that the alarming episode was merely the result of a single sleepless night and temporary fatigue. The future king pointed directly toward the abandoned, neglected papers and answered with unflinching clarity that temporary weakness could still carry permanent, devastating consequences for the nation. If a vital state decision were ever misunderstood or mismanaged, the resulting damage would reach far beyond one exhausted man. It could shake public trust in the monarchy itself to its very foundations. Feeling judged where his son intended only fierce protection, Charles bristled with sudden resentment. He sharply accused William of eagerly waiting in the wings for the exact moment when royal authority would finally pass into his own hands. The accusation struck like a physical blow. The prince stepped closer, his voice steady yet filled with emotion, answering that he was not watching for power, but rather because he was absolutely terrified of losing his father. Neither man looked away, and neither knew how to bridge the painful chasm that had suddenly opened between them. Sophie finally broke the heavy silence by presenting a meticulously maintained written log from her private records, detailing 3 previous occasions when the king had become too exhausted to complete his essential constitutional work. Staring at the precise dates written in her familiar handwriting, Charles realized with a jolt that she had quietly documented the steady physical decline he had fought so hard to dismiss. Defeated, the king closed the red box, turned its small brass key, and pushed it across the polished wooden table toward William without releasing his grip on the lid. He commanded them both to maintain absolute secrecy regarding the incident until one final, desperate attempt at maintaining a normal schedule could be made. That single command laid the foundation for the elaborate web of secrecy that would later shock the nation when it finally unraveled. Camilla soon discovered that official state duties were secretly reaching William behind her back, operating entirely outside her knowledge. The queen consort believed those responsibilities belonged exclusively to her husband, viewing the growing transfer of paperwork as an encroachment on his reign. The locked red box had temporarily ended an argument between father and son, but it instantly ignited a fierce new battle involving the queen. Soon, a father, a son, and a queen would find themselves facing one another across the exact same table, locked in a tense struggle over the future of the crown while the physical strength of the monarch continued to fade away into the quiet shadows of Windsor Castle. Bab 2 English version, voiceover narration, 8,000 characters. The confrontation escalated rapidly inside the private chamber as Camilla pulled the proposed transfer of responsibilities toward herself and confronted William across the polished mahogany table with undisguised fury. She accused the prince of weaponizing a temporary medical setback to force an early succession, aggressively stripping his father of purpose and dignity long before the monarch had chosen to surrender his authority. The queen consort fiercely warned that once the British public grew accustomed to seeing the future king lead every single national event, any future absence from Charles would instantly look permanent, effectively sealing his fate before he was ready to step down. Her anger was driven by something deeply protective, the terrifying, unspoken possibility that true recovery was no longer waiting ahead for her husband. William refused to retreat an inch from his position, answering with calm, unyielding resolve that maintaining a false appearance of strength had already placed his father under intolerable, life-threatening pressure. The prince reminded everyone in the room that Charles had repeatedly forced himself to dress for public engagements he was physically incapable of completing, and had stubbornly reviewed complex government papers long after exhaustion had completely shattered his concentration. Pushed to his absolute limit, the monarch suddenly slammed his hand down flat against the table, cutting through the escalating argument with a command that silenced the entire room instantly. "Do not decide my reign without me," Charles commanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw grief and wounded pride. Before anyone could recover from the shock of the king's outburst, Sophie acted with swift, quiet precision. She placed her meticulously documented record of missed briefings directly onto the table in front of the monarch, explaining through the confidential household account just how frequently the king had been forced to stop working due to sheer physical exhaustion. Charles opened the leather-bound log, instantly recognized the precise dates written in her familiar handwriting, and looked up at his trusted confidant with an expression of profound, wounded betrayal. She desperately tried to explain that the confidential record existed solely to protect him from making a catastrophic public error, but the damage to his pride was already done, and he slowly pushed his chair away in silent protest. It was during this deeply emotional confrontation that Charles finally revealed he had secretly drafted a comprehensive plan of his own. His personal blueprint granted William significantly greater executive authority than the initial proposal had requested, but it simultaneously imposed a strict, uncompromising boundary around Camilla's office. While she would continue to support her husband as queen consort, she was strictly forbidden from creating a separate center of royal power or interfering with the constitutional duties being transferred to the heir. Camilla's fierce fury instantly collapsed into quiet resignation when Charles admitted the heartbreaking reason why he had hidden the truth for so long. He lived in constant, paralyzing fear that every disagreement would be publicly weaponized as a vicious battle for the crown. Some mornings, the king confessed with agonizing vulnerability. He dressed for official duty, while privately knowing he lacked even the basic strength to walk out of his private residential quarters. The queen consort reached out a comforting hand toward him, but Charles slowly lowered his eyes, unable to meet her gaze. William now understood with crystal clarity that mere verbal agreement among the family was no longer sufficient. Someone had to actively transform his father's chaotic wishes into a stable, enduring royal arrangement. Yet, lurking behind their shared grief stood a much colder, more uncomfortable question that no one wanted to voice out loud. Who could possibly carry the sovereign's immense burden without making Charles feel that his sacred crown had already been stripped from his head? Power inside an ancient institution like the monarchy rarely shifts through a single, dramatic command or a sudden public decree. Instead, it alters subtly and relentlessly through altered appointment diaries, redirected government briefings, reassigned public audiences, and doors that begin opening for one person rather than another. Yet, behind those carefully managed administrative changes lay a painfully human reality that could not be legislated away. Charles still legally wore the heavy crown on his head, but William was already carrying the vast majority of its daily operational weight. Every single official signature placed before the prince served as a stark reminder of why this agonizing transfer of power had become an absolute necessity for the survival of the institution. Senior palace advisors worked tirelessly behind closed doors to construct a comprehensive continuity framework, a practical, shock-absorbing plan designed to keep royal duties moving forward seamlessly without formally stripping the sovereign of his title. Under this framework, William would undertake the vast majority of public leadership engagements, while Charles retained his constitutional position and essential state powers. While counselors of state are legally permitted to perform certain official functions when the monarch is unavailable, those constitutional powers alone could never manage the hundreds of everyday hospital visits, diplomatic receptions, private meetings, and national commitments that defined royal life. The family desperately needed something much broader, much more adaptable, and infinitely more personal. William stepped into his very first expanded operational briefing alone, feeling the profound weight of the empty chair normally reserved for his father sitting directly across the table. He rested one hand against the back of the leather chair, feeling a deep pang of sorrow, when a well-meaning aide immediately offered to remove the piece of furniture to modernize the room. The future king firmly refused. The chair had to remain in its exact place because this was still the reign of King Charles III, even if his son was now bearing the heavy workload that once belonged to him alone. Keeping the empty chair in the room also served as a constant visual reminder to everyone present that transferred duty was never the same as transferred ownership. The prince harbored a deep-seated fear that accepting executive authority too eagerly would grievously wound his father's fragile emotional state. Yet refusing it entirely could plunge the monarchy into a catastrophic period of leaderless chaos precisely when the nation needed stability most. Every single choice carried a heavy burden of pain. Success would inevitably make William appear ready to replace the king prematurely, while hesitation could leave the crown completely paralyzed. Facing the long-serving, traditional aides, Sophie displayed an equal measure of resolute strength. She calmly explained to the rigid courtiers that true loyalty no longer meant blindly obeying every single instruction Charles issued during fleeting moments of stubborn determination. Sometimes, it meant courageously refusing him when those demands threatened his fragile recovery. The trusted confidant knew all too well that those words would feel like an unforgivable betrayal to individuals who had spent their entire lives training never to question the sovereign's word. Still, she insisted with unshakable conviction that protecting the physical man had become entirely inseparable from protecting the crown itself. Furthermore, Charles's own documented private plan carried an even sharper, more explicit warning for the entire household. One strict clause explicitly declared that no royal relative could ever use his reduced workload to establish a rival court, an unofficial center of influence designed to compete with the monarch's household or independently redefine the future trajectory of the institution. This specific restriction was aimed directly at preemptively neutralizing any potential conflict between William's growing office and Camilla's loyal staff. It exposed just how deeply the king feared that his declining health might inadvertently divide his own family into opposing, warring camps. Charles finally took a deep breath, signed the formal delegation papers, removed his reading glasses, and silently offered the gold pen to William. His son accepted it with solemn reverence, held it briefly in his palm, and then placed it gently beside his father's trembling hand. Neither man uttered a single word to describe the profound gesture, but both understood the silent agreement. Royal authority could be shared effectively without robbing the sovereign of his inherent dignity. Camilla read through the newly established restrictions in total silence, slowly realizing that her official office would now have to operate within rigid boundaries she had never anticipated or desired. Before she could voice her objections or launch a formal challenge, a deeply personal and highly anticipated public appearance was abruptly canceled without warning. A single empty seat at a solemn national remembrance service would make continued secrecy utterly impossible, instantly throwing the entire royal household into a full-scale crisis. The very first tangible consequence of their private restructuring was not a grand constitutional announcement broadcast across the BBC or a formal change in royal titles, but rather an uncomfortably empty chair that spoke volumes. Charles had previously promised to attend a private memorial service marking a historic anniversary that carried enormous personal and emotional meaning for him. Yet, merely minutes before the scheduled departure time, the king suffered a sudden wave of severe dizziness and was forced to admit that he could not physically make the journey. When the royal Bentley departed from the courtyard without him, those closest to the sovereign understood with chilling clarity that their carefully guarded secret had finally outgrown the castle walls, and maintaining silence was rapidly becoming far more damaging than telling the raw truth. Questions from the press spread like wildfire across London within minutes. Several high-profile engagements had already quietly vanished from the royal diary, the official calendar listing the sovereign's planned duties, patronages, and public appearances. Each previous disappearance had been carefully explained away by press officers as a sensible, routine part of post-treatment recovery. However, this particular memorial service was entirely different because Charles had given his personal, unwavering promise to attend. His unexplained absence sent an unmistakable signal to the public that sheer willpower and royal determination were no longer enough to overcome whatever medical reality the palace steadfastly refused to name. The House of Cards was beginning to tremble. William carefully reviewed the official statement prepared by the communications staff, his eyes stopping abruptly at a single concluding sentence that optimistically promised a full return to a complete schedule in the near future. The prince immediately shook his head and refused to authorize its release. He understood all too well that offering yet another comforting, empty assurance might successfully calm the public anxiety for a single day, but it would completely obliterate public trust the absolute moment the next unavoidable cancellation inevitably arrived. His uncompromising decision forced the entire royal household toward the exact truth Charles had spent months trying desperately to delay. After the royal motorcade departed for the service, Charles remained sitting alone in his private study, still fully dressed in his formal morning coat. With slow, deliberate movements, he unbuttoned one heavy silver cufflink, placed it carefully on the bedside table, and looked towards Sophie with a heartbreaking expression. "They have begun leaving without me," he whispered softly. Those quiet words struck the trusted confidant far harder than any burst of royal anger could have. She gently reminded him that his devoted family was merely carrying his lifelong service forward, ensuring that his vital commitments continued even when his physical strength faltered. The king slowly shook his head, lamenting that being represented by proxy was never the same as truly being present. Camilla received William's revised, highly realistic announcement minutes later and instantly comprehended the full magnitude of what the prince had done. The queen consort felt deeply excluded from a major decision concerning her own husband, yet her frustration was tempered by the undeniable realization of how dangerous another misleading press release would be. Having previously defended total silence as a necessary form of protection, she now recognized that continued public denial could easily transform widespread national sympathy into bitter suspicion and outrage. Panic within the household deepened even further when a senior staff member accidentally discovered that a pre-recorded video confirmation featuring William and Sophie had already been fully produced and safely stored in the archives. The mere existence of that pre-recorded video proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the inner circle had fully anticipated a grim scenario where Charles might never become strong enough to deliver the tragic news to the nation himself. The king had personally selected William and Sophie for this solemn duty, as documented in his private instructions, because he desperately wanted the hard truth spoken by figures universally associated with unwavering duty rather than personal ambition. Charles listened to the completed recording in absolute solitude, closing his eyes tightly as his son's emotional voice echoed through the quiet room, explaining with painful clarity that the monumental decision belonged to the monarch himself. When the audio playback finally ceased, the king sat in profound silence for several long minutes before giving his formal, irrevocable permission for its immediate release to the world. William returned to the private quarters shortly after the public announcement went live, arriving without advisors, flashing cameras, or rehearsed talking points. The global public was finally hearing what his father had concealed for months behind closed doors. But the hardest, most defining truth of all still awaited them inside those quiet walls. A reigning king and his grieving heir now had to face each other and admit what months of grueling royal duty had made nearly impossible to say out loud. The quiet that settled over Windsor Castle carried the bittersweet weight of a historic transition completed not through defeat, but through profound grace. Standing together beside the window as distant bells marked the passing hour, Charles and William no longer needed to argue over schedules, medical limitations, or public appearances. The bitter tensions and hidden resentments that had fractured the household for months dissolved into the understanding that true strength sometimes requires the courage to stop. Charles remained the sovereign, retaining his constitutional crown and the sacred title of king. But the crushing, exhausting workload of daily public life had finally been shared, lifting an intolerable burden from his shoulders. William stepped forward into his expanded role, not as a rival claimant eager for power, but as a devoted son carrying forward his father's enduring legacy. Supported steadfastly by Catherine, whose own quiet strength protected their young family from the fierce pressures of public scrutiny, the prince embraced his new responsibilities with solemn dedication. Sophie continued her vital work alongside Anne and Edward, ensuring that the working royal family remained a unified, dependable pillar for the nation. Even Camilla, having turned away from the exhausting struggle for influence, found peace by focusing entirely on her husband's comfort and companionship, allowing domestic harmony to replace political conflict. That evening, the king entered a small family dining room without briefing papers, red boxes, or ceremonial folders. Instinctively, William rose from his chair, expecting his father to take his traditional place at the head of the table. Charles gently motioned for him to remain seated and chose the chair directly beside him instead. Catherine watched the tension finally vanish from her husband's face, while Sophie and the rest of the family exchanged quiet, reassuring smiles. Later that night, William carefully stored his father's handwritten message among his most private papers, not as a legal instrument of power, but as a poignant reminder from a father that the future had arrived sooner than either man desired. Illness had stolen strength and routine, but truth had restored peace to a father, purpose to a son, unity to a family, and unbreakable stability to the British crown.